You know, when you really think about it, war is just woven into the very fabric of America's story. From the very first fight for independence to interventions all across the globe, conflict has constantly shaped and reshaped the United States. Today, we're going to trace that exact journey.
So that brings us to the big question, right? How have all these wars, the victories, yeah, but also the losses, and all the messy stuff in between, how have they truly forged this nation's identity, drawn its borders, and defined its place in the world?
So, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the early wars that literally created the country's borders. Then, we'll look at the brutal conflict that almost tore it in two. After that, America's rise as a global power. We'll then dive into the complex fights of our own century. And finally, look at how a nation tries to reckon with its own past.
All right, so let's start at the very beginning, with the wars that literally drew the map of the United States. These early fights were all about two things: breaking away from an empire and then pushing west.
You've got these three huge foundational conflicts right at the start. Of course, there's the Revolutionary War, the fight for independence itself. Then you've got the War of 1812, which is basically America proving that independence wasn't a fluke. And finally, the Mexican-American War, a conflict that was, plain and simple, about expansion. But here's where it gets interesting. Take a look at the numbers for the Mexican-American War. Way fewer soldiers served, right? But the number of dead, it's shockingly high, way more than the other two. That tells you just how unbelievably brutal this war of expansion really was.
And the payoff for that brutality? It was absolutely massive. We're talking about a move that completely redrew the map of North America, adding this enormous chunk of land that would eventually become the American Southwest.
But after all that outward expansion, the biggest test for the nation didn't come from the outside. No, it came from within. The Civil War wasn't about gaining new land. It was a fight for the very soul of the country.
And you can just see the massive imbalance right here. The Union had the numbers, the money, everything. But look at the Confederacy, getting more than 1 million men to fight from a population of just 8 million. That's practically total mobilization. It shows how deeply that side was committed to its cause.
But this is the number that just stops you in your tracks. 620,000 dead. To put that into perspective, more Americans died in the Civil War than in every single other American war combined, right up until the Vietnam War. It is by far the nation's bloodiest chapter.
Okay, so once the country started to piece itself back together, its gaze turned outward. And in the 20th century, America didn't just step onto the world stage, it exploded onto it. The scale of war was about to get a whole lot bigger.
I mean, look at this timeline. The 20th century was just relentless. It's like a non-stop series of conflicts, one after the other. Kicks off with a quick war against Spain, then blows up into 2 world wars, and then morphs into these long, grinding proxy wars during the Cold War. It was a century defined by global conflict.
And the money? The money involved is just mind-blowing. The jump from World War I to World War II isn't just a step up, it's a whole different universe. It's more than a tenfold increase. What you're seeing here is the total transformation of the American economy into a war machine.
And of course, it wasn't just about dollars and cents. It was about people. And this chart says it all. World War II was different. Over 16 million Americans put on a uniform. That is a scale of mobilization that just dwarfs every other conflict in that century. So, why keep fighting after the biggest war in history was over? Well, it all comes down to one thing: the Cold War. This massive ideological struggle between the US and the Soviet Union. They never fired a shot directly at each other, but instead, they turned places like Korea and Vietnam into these horrific, bloody battlegrounds.
You'd think the end of the Cold War would mean peace, right? Wrong. The enemy just changed. Instead of a superpower, the new threat was terrorism, which gave birth to a whole new kind of American war.
And this is just a quick look, but you can see the pattern, can't you? The wars of the 21st century, they're different. They're not declared wars between nations. They're these sprawling, decades-long interventions fought against shadowy groups across multiple countries, often all at the same time.
Now let's talk about the two big ones, Afghanistan and Iraq. The numbers are just astronomical. We're talking almost $4 trillion when you put them together. Millions of American troops cycled through over 20 years, and thousands of lives lost.
And then, in the middle of all this, comes this bombshell quote. The CIA's top guy on the ground in Iraq, the one sent to find the weapons of mass destruction, says flat out, "We were all wrong." It was a stunning public admission that the very reason for the war was based on a catastrophic failure.
So that quote really forces us into our final chapter here. How does a country, a superpower, deal with a mistake of that magnitude? How does it even begin to acknowledge its past?
Well, official apologies from the U.S. government are, let's be honest, incredibly rare. And when they do happen, look at what they're for. They aren't for starting a war, they're for specific, undeniable wrongs against people, and a lot of the time, against its own citizens.
And this brings up a really important point: the difference between regret and an apology. Expressing regret, which a lot of officials did over the bad intelligence in Iraq, is basically saying, "We're sorry it turned out this way." A formal apology, on the other hand, is admitting, "We were wrong to do this." They are worlds apart.
And really, that's the bottom line here. As a nation, the U.S. just doesn't apologize for going to war. It's not really done. But the public admission of mistakes, of faulty intelligence, like we saw with Iraq, that represents a major shift. It's a willingness to question the reasons for war out in the open, which you just didn't see in older generations.
So, all of this leaves us with one last big question. When we add up the money and we count the bodies, what are we still missing? What is the real cost of all this conflict to a nation's character, to the trust we have in our leaders, and maybe to its soul?